I am joined today, in addition to being here myself, as Director of Massachusetts Programs with Civics. I'm also representing the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition, which is hosting this session and also this week-long series of sessions during Civic Learning Week. I'm also joined today by my colleague, Laura DeSalvo, who is taking care of things behind the scenes this afternoon. So thank you for being here, Laura, as always. So as I mentioned, we are going to record this session. We will ask that you remain on mute for part of the session today. We have some questions for you and hope to have some interaction in the course of the session as well. So feel free to unmute yourself and participate in person as it might be that way, or simply include your comments in the chat. But we do encourage you, we're a pretty small group, I think, to feel free to unmute yourself and participate with your actual voice. If you are having tech issues this afternoon, do make sure that you could try turning off your video as a way to potentially deal with that. So just a potential useful tip for you on that. So just a little introduction about the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition. If you're not familiar with the coalition, it's a group of about 30 organizations across the state. These are nonprofits, school districts, youth engagement groups, and research institutions. Some of them that have national standing as well. And we have come together over the last 4 years or so to combine our forces to try to support improve civic education in Massachusetts. And we've actually had some quite great success in the last couple of years. We aren't the only game in town on that, but we are certainly a major champion for the new civics law that came through in 2018, and have continued to be very active in supporting additional funding for civic education in the state and working very closely with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education on that as well. So again, welcome to the session this afternoon. If you're not familiar with the coalition, you should know as well that we, in addition to what I just described, we also do provide a lot of resources for educators, students, and families. If you go to our website that's included in the chat, you'll access the resources page that we put together, particularly to address the COVID-19 emergency, but we have a lot of other material there that certainly addresses many other circumstances as well. We've pulled that together particularly to be useful in both a remote learning situation as well as in person, and hopefully supporting families as they're serving partly as teachers these days too. So as I mentioned, this is part of Massachusetts Civic Learning Week. This is the first, what we hope will be an annual event. And we've really created this to sort of amplify the focus on civic education and the importance of that in our state and nationally. I think all of us could point to many events in our recent national history that indicate the importance of civic learning and the need to really improve that. And we're really intent on doing that. So this week is a way to sort of bring some focus to that and to help share what the wealth of many organizations across the state and what they have to offer to support that effort. So we're glad you're with us and hope you can take in the remaining events both later today and tomorrow. We'll also be posting all of the recordings of these sessions on our website, so you can access them at another time and certainly refer other people to check them out as well. So I'll just mention that we do have a series of these 3 particular webinars that extend beyond or before and after this Civic Learning Week. The focus this month happens to be Civics, Student Voice, and Equity, but we've also had a session last month that was focused on better supporting administrators in making sure that civic education is happening K-12. And we have a really good session coming up, certainly one that we expect to be a really good one around elementary grades and teaching civics, making sure that civics is a key piece of elementary education. And that'll be coming up on May 25th. And there'll be information later on in the slides here about how you can access that to register for it on our website. So our focus on in these areas, particularly for these webinars, is drawn from some of the research, particularly the most recent report by Circle out of Tufts, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, which has highlighted some of the research findings about the state of civic education across the state. But in addition, have made some recommendations about that. And you can see those listed here. So we're really trying to address some of those high need areas in these webinars. And I'll just mention here that we're particularly intent in this session, focusing on the issue around equity and addressing student voice, making sure students have a role in their education here, particularly because that's certainly one of the findings in the report, that there's some inequity in places, and we want to make sure that there is better access to quality civic education for all students across the state. So the format today is we'll just do the introductions as we have been. I'm going to turn it over to our presenters in just a moment to have the bulk of the time to present some of their work and share some of their strategies and suggestions for addressing this issue in their presentation today. We'll also take a little bit of time at the very end to have some Q&A, so feel free to ask questions through the chat or simply unmute yourself once we go into that Q&A session there. So I just want to sort of provide a little context for this session today, and that's really that as educators, and particularly civics educators, I think all of us are very well aware of the importance of making sure that students not only learn about democracy and about participating civically, but also have the opportunity in their school experience to actually really experience and get involved in civic education, to actually do it. So that's particularly true, of course, today, nowadays, in these times, given the circumstances in which we live. All around us, in particular, we see very unfortunate evidence of just how deep the racial divide and the depth of our racial history is impacting all of our society. And just really how ingrained that is in our world, in fact. So we're really at a pretty important period in our history here to start to address that and to better come to terms with that and to build from that and improve on that. So much of obviously the response to COVID and the inequities in healthcare and in education and in the justice system, all are major symptoms of that situation in our society. And as educators, our role is especially important in addressing this issue. We have a rare position to give our students the opportunity to develop their own voices and to gain important experience in how to participate in our democracy, and hopefully about how to create change themselves and become very active, thoughtful participants in our civic life here in the United States. So we're really fortunate today to have two great presenters from Building Audacity, organization that you'll hear about in just a minute. Both of them are students at Tufts University, and I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves further. But Renee and Eve, thank you very much for being here this afternoon and taking the time to share some of your experience and your expertise in this area. So I'll turn it over to you, Renee, first to introduce yourself, and have Eve do that and take it away.
Yay. Thank you, David. Thanks for having us. This is really awesome. Great group. I'm excited for some good conversation. But hi, I'm Renee LaPointe Jameson. I'm a junior at Tufts University and I study environmental engineering. I'm also an accomplice at Building Audacity. So I co-coordinate their food distribution program that you'll hear more about shortly. And I also do some work establishing and helping co-design a hydroponic center to have produce grown by the community for the community in an urban farming format. So again, excited to be here.
Just like Renee mentioned, I am also an accomplice at Building Audacity, where I help manage the food program too. In addition to such, I started a change project called Igniting Change Through Compassion, where we provide resources and particularly healthy meals to our homeless populations in Boston, particularly on Mass Ave, where we not only provide meals, but we also engage in conversation to build community with these folks who don't feel like they're a part of our community. So I'm also happy that I'm here today. So today we're going to discuss, this is our timeline of our goals that we're going to talk today about in our presentation. So first, we're just going to get to know Building Audacity and what our work is about and what our morals. And then moving forward, we're going to talk about intentional project development, especially as it relates to community organizing with youth. And lastly, going to talk about how to create equitable youth-centered learning environments for K-12 classrooms. And so Building Audacity was founded with the purpose of increasing youth power. The Building Audacity mission is to support youth-led change making and to provide resources to adults interested in creating inclusive, youth-focused learning spaces. And so by that, we mean that a lot of our work is centered on, one, just really bringing up youth ideas and being able to provide them with the resources to bring their ideas and goals into fruition. And then while providing like mentorship and resources. And then on the side, also we work with community members to like meet them where they're at. So that's where the food program comes in. A lot of community members needed produce. And so we heard them and said, okay, we will get you healthy produce and we will deliver it to your door. So that's what Building Audacity is really all about. And so moving forward, our core values on the next slide. Here are our core values. And so you see in the center, it says youth-led. And so by that, we mean that we believe that our youth are the present and the future. And so all the programs are initiated by youth ideas and must have youth members on the organizing staff. And surrounding youth, that youth-led little bubble are these other aspects. One being collaboration and compromise. And so you'll see a lot of these things on our website, but we basically no one voice has more weight or value than other. Adults have the same voice as youth, and so no movement on an effort unless all can agree. So this means that our decision-making processes might be slow sometimes, but it ensures that all people at the table are invested and heard in decisions we make. Moving forward, we have prioritizing the most marginalized. And essentially, we just want our programs to be catered to ensure that those most marginalized will be able to thrive while participating in our efforts. Making space for humanity, that's just giving grace and patience to all people. And so that means that we start meetings with check-ins, we make time for real life to happen and hold our community with intentionality. And then lastly, there's decision-making with representation. And so each person directly affected by Building Audacity project leads the decision-making process. So surveys are sent to people to determine what services are needed and how they want to receive the said services. And so no program Building Audacity is made without first listening to our community. So we don't just say that, oh, you all need these things. We allow them to have a major input in that, and we meet them where they're at. So what does youth leadership at Building Audacity look like?
So Eve's talking about all these great values, but how does that actually come to fruition and how are youth actually taking charge in doing this? So amongst our middle school and high school accomplices, there's of our many change-making projects, there's the Say Their Name project. And it's actually co-led by a college-age accomplice, but he's basically working with 25 middle school and high schoolers. And they go through this youth action training to understand the roots of anti-Blackness, to understand the various systems that interrelate and impact their identity and the identities of those around them. And then using this understanding, they've been researching lives lost to due to the police and other forms of violence. And then they've been creating these art installations to honor those lives, to advocate for abolition, for reform in these various aspects of our society in which we're facing violence in. Because there's violence in our food systems, there's violence in many aspects of the things that impact us. And they're actually in the process of making 3 installations right now. So it's very cool work. Next slide, please. Another group we have in high school is supporting an organization called Building a Better Brookline. And this is a smaller group, but it's high school age students that are recognizing that our local government doesn't always reflect and include everyone in our communities. And so how can we advocate for one another and really demand fundamental change and specific change to the groups that we feel are not always included in these processes. So this is a youth-led advocacy an organizing group that does things around not only affordable housing, but accessible housing, equitable housing, ensuring that there's abundant housing for everyone involved, as well as positive environmental health. A lot of the communities that we work with, to be very specific, Black, Indigenous, other communities of color, low-income communities, are disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards due to racism in urban planning and local government. So we need to be very specific about advocating for equitable enforcement of pollution regulations and things like that. And this is youth-led. This is youth on the ground doing this work, going out and talking to people and engaging them and how they can be considering these things and how they affect all of us. So really awesome work around equitable governance. And then finally, Even Ice Project. I'm biased, it's probably my favorite, but no, it's all great. So what we're doing is we're providing fresh, culturally specific food to over 500 food insecure families throughout Greater Boston. And these are families that are often like elderly individuals, single adult or guardian homes with younger children. These are people that are differently abled, and they're all impacted by food insecurity and food apartheid, how racism, again, in urban planning and the way that our community is built is shaping access to essential goods. And I think what's really important about this project, it's been going on since the start of the pandemic. Food insecurity has been exacerbated by the pandemic, but despite that, we're making sure that our produce is not only of good quality, but again, it's what the community wants. So we often survey them in terms of engaging to ensure that it's food that they is culturally, again, specific and that they enjoy. So these are all youth-led things that are just very exciting initiatives of many. So now getting into civic education and how can we model what I would say is success at Building Audacity with these awesome youth-led initiatives in our classrooms, in our civic curriculum. So let's get into first, how can we actually make them inclusive so that Black and brown youth of different abilities, youth of different backgrounds and cultural identities can feel seen in these classrooms and also feel like they're a part of this education process. So I think the most important thing is starting at the concept that civic engagement is more than voting. And I know that to some people that seems obvious and that's a given for what's going on, but I remember, at least in my civic education, and honestly here at Tufts as well, I feel like voting and engagement with our system is centered as the best way to be involved as a citizen. And I don't think that's fair. I think it sets up a narrative for kids to feel like they need to wait to be a certain age to be involved in our system to have an impact. And I think it also disregards the many ways that voting and participation in formal government structures is inaccessible, is exclusive. And that can be formally in the fact that our undocumented community members can't vote. It can be in the fact that many of the immigrants that make up our Greater Boston and Boston community can't vote if they're not citizens. Or it can be literally polling sites that have structural and operational issues allowing people to get there. So what can we do to ensure that we're not just thinking about voting and centering that as a way to have power in a system that, again, doesn't represent us all? When we have, we the people on these slides, when that was written, it wasn't including all of us. So what can we do to make sure that our processes of developing local power aren't only dependent on working within the system? So on that note, I love Audre Lorde, and I'd love to hear a few people's thoughts on the concept of this quote of hers: "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." Has anyone seen this before? Does anyone want to comment on the relevance of this in terms of what we're talking about? Feel free to unmute.
I feel totally shy speaking. This is Andrea Doremus. I just came here all of a sudden, but since nobody else is talking. So I guess I first read that in This Bridge Called My Back when I was really young, and that totally transformed my life and basically helped me understand how important it is we need to look at institutional and structural, racism and the constructs that exist, and that unless we can begin to step outside of everything we've been taught and all the well, you guys will say it's smarter than me, but anyway, I just guess thank you for bringing it up, because it's just such a important way to kind of restructure and recreate how we have to look at things. So that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah,
okay.
No, thank you for sharing, Andrea. I think there's another hand up. Alex?
Yeah, sure. I can jump in or try to share some thoughts, but I think that was an awesome point, Andrea. Thanks for sharing. I think that something that comes to mind for me when I think about this quotation and this conversation particularly is like the idea of like individual versus systemic change, and also like what it means to like work as Andrew was just saying, like work within existing systems and like try to like change things from the ground up, or like kind of like a bottom up approach versus trying to think out of the box, or like trying to push against conformity in new and different ways. And I think like I'm sure this is something that you'll talk about more, but like trying to like balance those different approaches. And also I think in this quotation, like the idea of like the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. It's like a question of whether or not you can actually like use some of the existing structures that are there to push back against those same very structures, or you have to kind of like rebuild the wheel. And so that's something that maybe I'm thinking about. It's something also as like as a white person who's privileged in a lot of ways. I think about that a lot, because I think in reference to this quotation, like a lot of the master's tools can be a direct reference to a lot of like structures that are in place directly because of white people that perpetuate like racist and anti-Black practices. And so thinking about those as like the master and the master's tools, let alone also like references to like slavery and the history there too. So yeah, there's a lot to think about, but kind of jumbled thoughts. So yeah.
Oh my gosh, no, Andrea and Alex killing it with great thoughts, great comments. Thank you for sharing. You both nailed it. Yeah, it's the idea that this is a settler colonial government, and we can't be expecting everyone to feel comfortable engaging in these formal structures, and we can't be expecting the same system that created these issues to also be our source of collective liberation, because we're all tied up in each other, and our justice is tied up in each other, and we can't be looking to the same problems to be the solution. So I'm thinking a lot about especially the concept of voting and disenfranchisement, of course, being influenced by mass incarceration, and the idea that if convicted individuals are losing their votes, then there's an incentive in this country for people that are against our political structures to be incarcerated, which is obviously what we're seeing, and to lose their vote, as well as minorities. So there's a lot to unpack there, and I think it's very fair that the things you're pointing out. So thank you. So next slide, please. So we're talking about a lot of things. We're talking about systemic injustices. We're talking about the fact that our political structures will not be our source of being saved. So what can we do now that I've dropped, this sad bomb of reality? I think it's also centering, again, community organizing in civics, making sure that it's also seen as a very relevant and a very necessary process to engage in, not just as a community service project to graduate your senior year, but a model for youth to always be a part of and to always prioritize in the way that they're acting with their community and engaging with each other. So what is community organizing about? Of course, it's about building local power, but it's something that's intergenerational. So in that way, it's probably the most sustainable thing that's been going on in this nation, enacting the changes that we're not going to always see coming from, again, our formal government structures. And as Eve brought up earlier, it's also about communities knowing their problems best, often being denied the resources and the tools to enact that, but they know their solutions best. And it's about allowing that to thrive and come to fruition. One of the things that Nikia, our lead troublemaker at Building Audacity, says is, whatever you're able to do, get out and organize, get out and vote. So I add to that, yeah, if able to, definitely do both. But our role isn't to force people to participate in things that they don't want to do. Our goal is to allow them to thrive in these environments and whatever they feel comfortable with and show up for each other. Next slide, please. So how do we center youth in this organizing process and allow them to see themselves in this work? I think first it comes to empowering youth to see themselves as leaders, and this can come in a lot of different ways, and it definitely varies by age group. But in elementary school students, I'm thinking about how we should be establishing the fact that everyone's a leader. Everyone's a leader, but we have diversity in leadership models and diversity in leadership styles. So one of the programming that I really like to do is this concept of animal leadership models. So you have kids do a quiz or some flow chart and figure out what animal leader they are. So it can be oh, I'm a lion leader, or I'm an elephant leader, and I'm an owl leader, something like that. and each one has different strengths and different things that they can improve on. And the feedback I've seen from teachers practicing this is that young kids will learn more about themselves and better be able to articulate what's important to them, but also be better able to engage with other students and their priorities as well. So I remember my friend was telling me about this time where two kids were having an argument about some project, and one of them said, okay, I get it, you know, you're a lion, you're going to be assertive, that's your style, I want to think about the plans more. Of course, like, they didn't say it like that, they were really young, but they were able to identify, like, okay, this is where we're disagreeing, but that disagreement doesn't come from hatred or like a malicious background. It's coming from, again, that diversity in styles and how can we accommodate and support each other to get through these disagreements. That's pretty advanced for young kids, but like super cool to see occurring. Amongst middle schoolers, I'm thinking about how in middle school I was super self-conscious and I wanted to figure out what is my role in my community and what can I do. So I think community mapping tools are really cool here to have youth establish not only themselves, but their relationship with their communities, what resources are available and how they connect with one another. And I think it starts making them think about the systems at play and, again, their role in either being complicit or challenging the status quo, so it's not being oppressive, so it's not harming some. And then finally, in high schoolers, I'm thinking about how one of our Building Audacity, core values is about representation. But we can't just say baseline representation. We can't just say that for image. This is about representation, advocacy, and values. So I think it's really important that when we're presenting high schoolers with organizers that they can maybe model and want to shape their own leadership skills off of, that it's for people and it's based on people that are also advocating and valuing them. So this is just a big way to say that Black, Indigenous, other communities of color, people of color, they're not monolithic. So just because you're a person of color doesn't mean you're going to be valuing equity in whatever work you're doing, whatever space you're doing. And that's allowing the complexity of what only white people are associated with to exist and permeate in all groups. So those are some thoughts. And then another big thing that I think really thrives at Building Audacity is that autonomy over your change making. So I think our role in supporting young people is to really act as sounding boards or soundboards. It's allowing them to have full control over their projects and simply be there to share resources, to celebrate with them, to enable them to critically think further and push them further. And at the root of this is understanding that if you have students that want to do a project and it's rooted in their personal experience and their lived experience, it's respecting that as a valid form of knowledge. I think so often in our classrooms, we say, unless your knowledge is validated by a formal institution for higher education, it's not important. And that's just not the case. And I think that gets in the way of a lot of organizing work because we should be rooting our policy, we should be rooting our action in what communities are experiencing and what they're doing and what they're feeling. So encourage your students to be able to share themselves authentically and emotionally in the classroom. And that's a privilege that especially students of color are not always granted. I'm going to go through this kind of quick and then we'll get into Eve's section. But these are just some thoughts that I've had that when I work with youth on what is sustainable and intentional community organizing with them, I found is really helpful in helping them guide through the process of creating a project that's meaningful to them and also is like constructive and like helpful. So yeah, the 5 W's and 1 H. So first is why. I think that all of our work should always be rooted in why we're doing it, why this problem exists. But to have youth, I think, especially flesh out the concept of why are some people more impacted by this than others, and understanding that it's not rooted in people's identities themselves, but the systems of oppression that shape them. So when we see, for example, a predominantly Black school that's not doing as well test scores wise than a predominantly white school, it's that anti-racist thinking that challenges you to say, how can we look at this situation and see what systems, unjust processes, policies are shaping these outcomes? Because we know fundamentally that it's not an achievement gap, it's not a difference in ability to achieve, it's an opportunity gap. So yeah, and then asking youth, why do you want to do this? And making sure that their relationship with whatever action they're taking isn't grounded in guilt or saviorism, wanting to just feel good. It's about meaningful connections with each other and caring for each other authentically. Next slide, please. Next, who to center. Again, in Building Audacity, we are always centering those that are impacted by the issue directly. We don't just work in collaboration with communities, we work under the vision of communities. And youth can do the same. And that can come through, interviewing, that can come through making sure that there are individuals of that identity group on your team in a meaningful and non-tokenizing way. What to do, I honestly, across all age groups, I think community mapping is really awesome because I think it better connects youth with, again, what is in your community and what are you benefiting from and what would you like more of? And I think that relationship to see what do you have and how has this allowed you to do things is really valuable. But I also think it's important to allow youth to consider what are others doing? Does a project that you are thinking about starting already exist? Because I think sometimes we can have that, and it's not a bad thing, that youthful arrogance of I have this amazing idea and I'm going to be the first to do it. And that's fine. Kids are great. That's cool. But when that's intertwined with whiteness, it can come with an arrogance of not recognizing the existing efforts of marginalized groups doing the work. So it's perfectly fine if your action plans involve, instead of doing something or creating something new, collaborating with others who are trying to expand what they're doing. And that means practicing intersectionality. Next slide. And for the record, intersectionality is just this idea that, our identities aren't separate from each other. We have compounded systems and identities that interrelate each other to each other, but also within ourselves. So when you're advancing, racial justice, you're also advancing gender equality, and you're also advancing economic justice. These things aren't separate. And I think introducing that to kids at a young age is a really cool way to feel more connected to each other and the work they're doing. This is just brief, when and where, just a reminder all the time, BIPOC are being, and when I say BIPOC, I'm talking about Black, Indigenous, people of color, are disproportionately impacted by COVID. Again, this isn't due to race, it's due to racism and the systems that are again, causing unequal access to fresh produce. The fact that BIPOC are disproportionately exposed to air pollution and other hazards that cause you to develop illnesses that make you susceptible to COVID. So as you're doing any of this work, just please be COVID safe. And finally, how? I think that in civics classrooms, we should be very frank about talking about also self-care. And if you're not comfortable with the concept of self-care, consider it like self-investment. You should be learning the skills in this space to learn how to engage in local government, learn how to engage in community work in a way that doesn't burn themselves out, and in a way that centers BIPOC, because they shouldn't have to be doing all this labor without supporting themselves and seeing what they can do to feel good as well. So this can be establishing metrics for growth. It can be living by your values, not just in your project, but in the everyday. So you can challenge yourself to show up for each other in like a lifelong commitment way, rather than just temporarily. And then lastly, I think due to the lack of time, we'll keep moving, but I love this quote from Lola Watson, and I'd love for everyone to reflect and think about it on your own, and maybe we can come back to it. But if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. At Building Audacity, we don't use the concept of being allies. We use the concept of being accomplices, because we're in this work together trying to accomplish this. We're trying to deal with these issues collectively, and no issue is someone else being generous with their time to show up. These issues are our issues. And if you teach kids at a young age that, again, this is about collective liberation, this is about us all coming and approaching this together, then community service, or community organizing doesn't become an extracurricular, it becomes a way of thinking of how to be a part of your community in a more engaged way. So I love to use this as a guiding idea, and I think it really resonates with different age groups. I don't know if we'll have time for this. We can come back to it later, but I'd love for Eve to talk more about equity in classrooms, and then we can always discuss at the end.
Yeah, so now we're transitioned to increasing equity in the classroom. So kind of focusing on what does equitable education look like in K through 12 classrooms. And I think it's just really important when talking about equity, talking about how that's an action step. So just before when I think about education, I feel like these are some really important questions we should, ponder about. So who is often centered in our education system, curriculum, and academic culture, and who is it our education system is not serving and supporting, and why not? So like being able to critically think through that, we can now identify the issue and then target it. So moving forward, we need to understand the issue, right? And so here are some just quick facts that I want to just bring up. Black and Latinx students, underrepresented students, are likely to not access education in all subject disciplines. So that's really huge, just like everything that they learn in school. Schools are not adequately funded and resourced, which leads to the detriment of quality learning. There are really low amounts of people of color as teachers, especially underrepresented teachers. Teachers are not getting enough professional development in racial literacy, equitable practices that encompass trauma-informed SEL, mastery grading, etc., and lack of restorative justice practices. And so I'm really going to be honing in on this section. And then lastly, extreme bias and racism in how students, especially Black students, are seen. And so I just have two little statistics I want to share really quickly. These come from the UNCF. The first one is that Black students are less likely than white students to have access to college-ready courses. So in fact, in 2011, only 50% of Black students have access to full range of STEM courses necessary for college readiness, compared to 81% of Asian American students and 71% of white students. In addition to that, even when Black students don't have access to honors and AP courses, or when they do, they are vastly underrepresented in these courses. And so Black and Latinx students represent at least 38% of students in schools that offer AP courses, but only 29% of those students enroll at least one AP. And so these underrepresented students are also, unfortunately, get less access to gifted and talented education programs than their white counterparts. And so what does all this mean, and how is this going to impact them in the now and in the future? And so moving forward, this is why I asked myself, like, why does equity matter? And so to me, this is something that goes full circle. And so if we want to just think about education as the base, so having inequitable education means that I'm not learning the amount of skills and things that I need to know, help me progress post-grad, right? So we spend most of our developmental and psyche developmental time in K through 12 education, right? We're all forced to do it. So why make it a bad time, you know? In K through 12 education, we're pushed to be critical thinkers, be pushed to be better decision makers, to be more empathetic, understanding our emotions, understanding how money works and how numbers work, so that we can be better people who budget our money in the future and all these other things. But now that Black and Latinx students don't get to learn all these skills, how's that impacting them now? So I think immediately as to like having bad education means that they're less likely to go to college. And so not going to college, unfortunately, means that you're less likely to get jobs that pay you well. So that means that they're possibly going to be low income. Being low income leads to a cascade of events, meaning less access to care because you can't afford it, or especially in terms of race, like they just aren't going to even get good healthcare because they're not perceived as well as others. Maybe housing, since they're low income, they're probably going to be in an area where housing isn't as great. And Renee touched on this a little bit about how environmental racism largely impacts lower income communities. And there's just like a lot of things. So I just think about, wow, like if I am going to give students a bad education K through 12, like what does that mean for their future? So really honing in on that empathetic side to like push us to want to do these equitable practices. So moving forward, what even are these equitable practices and these action steps? One of them is trauma-informed social-emotional learning. So trauma-informed practices also means building social-emotional competencies for students to empower all who are affected by adversity and help them cope with the trauma. So kids who experience trauma can be silent sufferers. And that's partly because trauma is stored in the nonverbal part of the brain. So it's not something easily identified, talked about, or expressed verbally, but it may only show up sometimes through behaviors. And we're going to talk about that when we get to restorative practices. Social emotional learning teaches kids to connect their actions to their thoughts and feelings by noticing feelings and physical sensations in their bodies. So heat might mean embarrassment and shame, and pressure might represent stress, and this tingling and muscular tension might represent anger and nervousness. And so why does that matter? Well, when kids start to understand the physical sensations of their bodies and connecting them to their emotions, only then can they learn how to name and describe their feelings, such as sadness, frustration, or anger. And that is how they safely learn to express their feelings in a healthy way, verbally or non-verbally, and learn the coping strategies for managing their feelings as well. And then another one is racial literacy. So educators having the knowledge, skills, awareness, and dispositions to talk about race and racism. So that's one big one, being able to even talk about race and racism without showing signs of verbal or nonverbal uncomfortableness that will, obviously underrepresented students see that. But in addition, knowing how to work with students of color, by being racially literate, you'll be able to know that, hey, I can't it'll be wrong for me to force students to learn white formal English and say that their Black dialect of English is wrong, right? Because if you're racially literate, you would know that Black dialect or any other dialect of English is a valid form of speaking English. But in our capitalistic and white supremacist country, we are told that the way these folks speak is incorrect, and the only people that speak right is if you speak white formal English. So being racially literate would make you aware of that and help you with your teaching practices. Moving forward, there's also the concept of cultural responsiveness, and that's a pedagogy that acknowledges, responds to, and celebrates fundamental cultures, offers full and equitable access to education for students from all cultures. So that can look like what do we do at Building Audacity, where we have cultural responsiveness, cultural responsive foods, where we're not going to go to an area that's predominantly Latinx and give them a produce that they don't really use. You know, what's the point of that? But by acknowledging what foods that are traditional to them and what they prefer, you know, we might as well meet them where they're at and provide the resources that they'll actually use, you know? And so that's kind of like not as education, but yeah, a good example. And then there's restorative justice practices. And that's a theory of justice that focuses on mediation and agreement rather than punishment. And so something really important about that I talked about in trauma-informed social immersion learning is that kids who experience trauma can be silent sufferers. And I said that most times when they do express it verbally, it's through behavior. Well, a lot of like Black students, especially who, unfortunately, a lot of Black people undergo a lot of trauma, especially at an early age. And so when they express that in schools, teachers will be immediate to suspend these students or do other disciplinary actions that don't work to their benefit at all. And so, you know, it makes sense that these students, you know, moving forward are going to be left behind because you're literally stunting their growth in education, because you're not allowing them time in the classroom, because you're not understanding why they're behaving the way they are. And rather than understanding, you're assuming that they're just bad, right? And you're doing that especially to certain groups of students. And so restorative justice practices, moving forward to the, I think 2 slides over. And after this one, restorative justice practices really focuses on some of these things, such as building relationships, striving to be respectful to all students, providing opportunity for dialogue, and also having participatory decision-making, and then involving all the relevant stakeholders. So, you know, having dialogue with the student and not at the student, that's a big one. Addressing the harms, needs, obligations, and causes of conflict and harm, and encouraging all to take responsibility. So like, this is just really important because you're going to talk to the student, understand what's going on, and work with them to move forward rather than just punish them, which punishment doesn't really lead to much progress for students. And so that's why, you know, things such as professional development that would teach these practices are really important. And there's a lot of research that notes, like, for example, here, that professional development leads to better instruction and improved student learning when it connects to the curriculum materials that the teachers use. So the district and state academic standards that guide their work, and the assessment and accountability measures that evaluate their success. And so hopefully this was really informational, and we talked about various things such as civic engagement, how that works, and then also like how you can support your youth in the classroom, because being able to teach your students and also empower them in the classroom allows them to be empowered in the real world and outside the classroom to pursue things that they really might be engaged to do, such as civic work. Renee, if you want to add on to that.
No, that was awesome. Thank you everyone for coming. And it looks like we have some time for discussion. We can maybe go back to some of like the visuals that Eve wanted to share, like the questions that I was hoping to talk about. But yeah, we're excited that you're stuck around. But yeah, feel free to unmute, share any thoughts, comments.
Does anybody have questions for Renee and Eve? You've given us a lot to think about here, a lot to digest.
This is Andrea again, just because no one else is saying anything. I just want to say thank you so much. You guys are, it's so hopeful for the world that you can be so clear and so that it's so set up in such a structured and practical way that can be made accessible to teachers and other people. And I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for coming.
Yeah, again, thank you. And talk about setting an example for youth empowerment, because damn, you guys are awesome and really set the bar for showing what it looks like to be qualified and to teach people what equitable leadership and practices look like, especially in education. So thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
So following up on that point, Alex, I think you make a great point that I think everybody's probably thinking right now. I do have a question for both of you, and that's really just what helped you to develop your own voice? You two are really establishing yourselves as leaders already. You know, right? You're in college and you're already leading the way. So what helped you to develop your own voices and get you to where you are today?
That's a great question. Eve, do you want to go first or do you want me to? Me? Okay. I feel like for myself, I grew up in an environment that lacked representation of people like myself. And there weren't a lot of people that were advocating on my behalf, or I didn't see representation of myself in spaces of leadership. So I think a lot of the work was just trying to move into those spaces in a meaningful manner to be able to advocate for myself, which honestly isn't healthy. The reality is a lot of Black and brown youth are forced to grow up faster because they're faced with adultification of themselves at a young age. Everyone always thought I was older than I actually was. And sometimes, at least for me, being the only Black student in an environment, and that's not I think amongst a lot of white people, if you say, for example, now I'm the only Black woman in my environmental engineering department, I think in our white capitalist culture, people will hear that and be like, wow, good for you. And I'm like, it's not good for me. I was just the lucky one that was able to move past certain barriers that were intentionally trying to exclude people like myself from this space. So I don't know. I personally don't think there's anything special about that. It's just a lot of this is luck working through a system that's working against us and trying to advocate for ourselves. And I think that good community is what raises good leaders. And I've been lucky enough to be supported by awesome people around me like Eve. So that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. I think I like to use my voice because I've realized that sometimes there's a lot of talk but no action, and being the person that needs the action to be done, it's like, okay, can you please do something, and by not doing the action step, it does nothing to support Black and Latinx folks. And so being a person that's had like to deal with the brunt of like food insecurity and not getting good education and all these things, I'm just kind of like, you know what, I'm going to just tell y'all what you're doing wrong, and this is how you're going to have to do it, and I will help you do these things. Because I think at the end of the day, there's like this quote I really love that says, I don't know how to explain to you that you should care about others. And I think showing care, like that, one of the best ways to do that is literally by action steps, whether that's saying you care about homeless folks. Is like, all right, go talk to them and figure out how you can support them, and go do something about it. You say that education is not working for Black and Latinx people. It's like, all right, so train yourself so that you can be a good educator to support these students so that you don't ruin their lives. It's like, do the work, like do it. And so I think I've been trying to use my voice to be persuasive, but also literally outline action steps that people can do. And then maybe like even representing those action steps.
I mean, you both have such a such a broad understanding of all this and such a sort of systemic view of it all, that I think it's really helpful for people like us who are sort of embedded in the education system to be able to step back and look at it this way a little bit. So it's really helpful for you guys to be presenting this today. I did wonder about, I think a lot of people on the call today probably have read the Let's Go There report that came out a couple of years ago, and it was really making a strong case with some research about really making a place for students' lived experiences, that term that you referred to in some of your discussion. Could you describe a little more about what that kind of thing looks like? What does it look like in in a classroom where, you know, most students are engaged these days.
I'm thinking about how if a student talks about, if a student of color in let's say Roxbury is talking about the fact that they have asthma and they don't always like being outside because they don't feel good and the air doesn't feel as nice as other areas they've been to, honoring that as like a real experience that can shape things, and also the fact that that is grounded in reality, that Roxbury and I think North Dorchester, I could be wrong there, I'm bad with labeling my Boston communities, have the most hazardous like levels of pollution and waste in our Boston area, and letting them say like that experience you have is valid, and not that they need your validation, but just saying like, no, that's a real thing that you're experiencing, and I'm going to honor that in this space. And what would you like to do about it? And what tools and resources can we provide you so that you can lead the change that you want to see regarding how you're feeling, how you're breathing and existing in these spaces? So this is actually a real scenario that I'm describing with actually a different organization called Alternatives for Community and Environment that is based in Roxbury. And they basically did that with a student. And the outcome was this awesome 5-year campaign led by youth that led to the diesel emissions like reduction ordinance that's now in place and preventing idling vehicles in a lot of our Boston areas. So I think it's just when you create space for students to one, share those experiences, but what Eve is talking about is making sure that your very classroom is comfortable enough for them to present those concerns in an authentic way, then that's where incredible discussion and projects can come from. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. Eve, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I guess like one of the ways I think about it in terms of the classroom is just is you were asking, can you repeat your question for me just so I can make sure I'm answering it correctly?
Yeah, sure. Eve. It was about the report that came out a few years ago about it's called Let's Go There, which is really making the case with a lot of research to back it up about the importance of making a place in schools for students to refer to their own lived experiences as the basis for their motivation for being civically engaged and hopefully engaged in school.
Yeah. You know, I feel like this kind of like touches more on like, you know, cultural responsiveness in schools. And so I know that I had this image I didn't get to talk about, but it was like this cultural responsiveness continuum that I believe the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education released here in Mass. And so 2 of their last parts of the spectrum was cultural responsiveness and then cultural sustaining. And I really like those because cultural responsiveness really touched on drawing on diverse backgrounds, strengths, and challenges to deepen learning. So adapting your instruction to incorporate strategies that appeal to students. So allowing students to pitch ideas for a project instead of telling them what they must do, and that you know in turn allows students to showcase their strengths, where then cultural sustaining would be seeking to foster and explicitly support students diverse backgrounds, identities, and strengths and challenges. So that you can do that by connecting present learning to histories of racial, ethnic, and linguistic communities and to the histories of neighborhoods and cities they are a part of. So it kind of makes, like what we see here, it makes them feel like their lived experiences are valid. I also really care about the racial literacy portion of like not telling students that their dialect of English is incorrect. I think a lot of people say like that Black dialect or Ebonics or whatever you want to call it is not professional or correct form of English. And I think that's just racist, right? And so figuring out a way to like include those different forms of dialects that aren't just white centered, I think is really important for students in their development, and also not making them feel like they're less than because they speak a certain way because of how they were raised and their identity as a whole.
Great, thanks, Eve. So we are getting to the end of our time here, and I think we could probably take another hour here and have more discussion with both of you, but we are going to have to wrap up. So I wondered if you had anything else you wanted to add as a parting thought. You had some really good quotes today and a lot of really thought-provoking ideas. So I just wondered if there's something particularly you want to have people take away from this session.
I guess I'm thinking about how oh, it's so powerful to be talking with educators. So much responsibility in your roles. But I hope that you don't view presentations and the ideas that we shared or reshared, because these aren't ours, not as extracurriculars or like side things to do. And the point of this also isn't to add more to your plate, because educators already have so much to do, but like consideration of equity, consideration of how to make your classroom a safe space for everyone culturally. Like that's just a necessary baseline thing to do. And it hasn't been done historically. And I think that when you shift your mindset from this is a burden and this is a side thing, you don't make it like a personal priority. But no, we need to be showing up for all students in this like authentic, real way. So thank you for taking the time to be here, and know that the work continues.
Exactly. Yeah, like being a teacher doesn't mean that you're working to support only certain groups of students. Your job is literally to help all students. And so equitable practices are non-negotiable, because if to complete the goal of being a teacher means that you have to learn the skill sets to be able to teach in a way that works for all students, right? And continuously learning how to meet students where they're at so that you help them progress and not stunt, their learning. And so I just really want to urge that action steps are the most important thing, but action steps look like reading and learning how to practice these different practices like racial literacy and cultural responsiveness, restorative justice, things like that. And, your impact by, giving students a really good time in education allows them to develop more and helps them become more independent thinkers who now can probably do these civically engaged projects on their own and have their really creative ideas and feel confident when they speak about their ideas. And so you're really helping them to move to the next level to help others, and progress the world in like a better direction. I really feel like.
So Renee and Eve, thank you so much for leading the session this afternoon. I think you've given us so much to think about, and some really fairly concrete starting points, particularly with some of the strategies you shared, Eve, about how to incorporate this into the K-12 program. So thank you for that. And I hope folks can take some of that and actually put that into practice in some of our own work as educators. So thanks so much for the session this afternoon. I do want to just point out to folks before we wrap up here that we do have an evaluation for this session that we'd appreciate you completing. It's really helpful to get your feedback on these sessions so we can make sure that future sessions are best addressing your needs in your situation, and just give us some ideas about how this one went. So take a moment to fill out the evaluation that's in the chat there. There's a link there. And we do have another session, webinar coming up, hosted by the Mass Civic Learning Coalition on May 25th, as I mentioned, same time of day. But the focus on that is civics in the elementary grades. Renee and Eve gave us a couple examples of how to start that, how to get kids started on some of this, developing their civic identity in the elementary grades. And certainly the focus at this next session will be stepping off from that, but how to build even more of an elementary curriculum that's focused on civics and make sure that civics actually has a place in the elementary grades, something that we're not seeing enough of these days. So take a look. There is a link as well in the chat, I believe, here for registration for that session on our Mass Civics for All website. So feel free to register for that when you get a moment. And again, thanks again to Eve and Renee and Building Audacity for all of their work, their continuing work, and certainly for the presentation this afternoon. We are going to wrap up here. Thanks for all of you for attending this afternoon, and we'll look forward to seeing you at future sessions.